And simply put, if you are eating the right amount of carbs in total, but you are eating them at the wrong times, your performance and recovery can still tank. All too often, I see athletes avoiding sugar out of fear and then sort of wondering why their legs are disappearing halfway through a workout when they started off feeling really strong. So you get your fueling more consistent and then your training becomes more consistent. And when your training gets more consistent, then your results and your progress get more consistent too. Welcome to The Unfiltered Athlete, the show where we get real and honest about training, nutrition, performance, and mindset. I'm Georgia Radley, nutritionist, athlete, coach, and now the host of the Unfiltered Athlete podcast. I'm here to help you fuel smarter, train harder, and actually enjoy the process. Join me as I share practical advice, science-backed strategies, and all the things I learned and got wrong along my journey from starting in the gym as a complete beginner to competing internationally in 2 different sports. Last week, I took you through the process of nailing your protein intake, from how much to eat to actually starting to hit that target consistently. And the week before, I took you through my signature process for working out exactly how many calories your body needs based on your data, not generic calculators or ChatGPT that will spit out a million different answers. So now you know how much protein you need, you know how many calories you need to eat. The next step is understanding what type of fuel gives you the best performance, the best recovery, and the best results. And today we're talking about the one macronutrient that most athletes and casual gym goers too misunderstand the most: carbohydrates. Whether it's thinking you need to eat clean and fearing sugar, thinking that carbs are going to make you bloated and heavy or even make you just gain fat, or maybe it's confusion about how much you should be eating. There's one half of the internet telling you that you need to be eating more carbs and the other half telling you that you need to eat less, or even that you don't need them at all. There's all this mixed messaging going on when ultimately most athletes are under-eating carbs, mistiming carbs, or eating the wrong types of carbs at the wrong times, or a combination of all of the above. So in this episode, I'm simplifying it all. We're going to be talking about exactly what impact carbs have on performance, recovery, and day-to-day energy levels, what happens in your body when you don't eat enough, and how to spot the signs that you might be underfueling, and how to use carbs strategically and intentionally to fuel better and train better, including eating the right amounts, the right types, and even understanding how when you eat them around training matters. And yes, that includes you, even if you swear you can't eat before training. And I'm so excited about this episode because by the time you finish listening to this deep dive, carbs won't be confusing or scary or something you're relying on guesswork to figure out. You will understand exactly how to use them and feel confident in fueling your training instead of constantly wondering whether you're eating too much, too little, or the wrong thing altogether. So let's jump in. Now, if there's one macronutrient that athletes overthink, fear, demonize, or just wildly misunderstand, it is carbohydrates. I think they've been through every possible PR disaster. From early low-carb diets, the rise of keto, to the recent caveman diet trend of just demonizing carbs full stop. We've got the eat clean or sugar is toxic crowd, or my personal favorite, as addictive as cocaine, said without fail by someone who has never done cocaine in their life. And then we've got the carbs make you fat myth, which is sometimes a variation of the no sugar thing, because of course it makes perfect sense that certain carbs could make you magically gain fat, whereas others couldn't. And then we've even got bullshit flying around about how fruit is bad for you because of the sugar. So there is a lot to unpack, not all of which I can cover within this episode, but it is no wonder that athletes are getting carbs all wrong, or second guessing every bowl of pasta that they eat, or chopping and changing between the approach they take, with none of them ever really sticking. And ultimately, we end up with 3 major issues. Number 1 is not eating the right amount of carbs. Number 2 is not eating the right types of carbs. And number 3 is not understanding how carb timing matters. So let's start with the big one, and maybe the most important one: eating the right amount of carbs. Most athletes aren't eating enough, at least not consistently and intentionally eating enough. And what I mean by this is that very often athletes will underfuel when it comes to what they're doing deliberately. Like maybe they're setting themselves calorie targets or they're planning their meals, that sort of thing. And that plan that they have is not providing enough carbs. So then they're either constantly underfueling or they get stuck in this restriction and binging cycle, which is where I was stuck for so long, because they're trying so hard to stick to something that's just not realistic and not giving them enough fuel. And then they end up overeating, feeling rubbish about it, and then swinging back to that underfueling, and so on. This cycle repeats. And I remember in my CrossFit days, I'd have people telling me, like, you need to eat more carbs if you want to get stronger. Then I had other people telling me, your gymnastics could improve if you've got a bit leaner, or commenting on me eating popcorn. I literally distinctly remember someone saying, can't believe you're eating that. That's packed with sugar. That's really bad for you. So I was getting all of this mixed messaging thrown at me by coaches, by people that I respected and looked up to. And it just resulted in me feeling pretty conflicted and really not confident in sticking with any single approach. And you might relate to some of that, or you might have heard myths about carbs making you gain weight, or that carbs will make you bloated or make you feel heavy and sluggish, especially if you eat them before training. But if you really want to feel your best and achieve the level of performance and body composition that you're really capable of, you're going to need to ditch these myths. And to address one of the most common ones, carbs do not make you gain body fat. A prolonged calorie surplus does. But what can happen, which I think is where a lot of the confusion comes from and how the myths about carbs equaling fat gain and cutting carbs equaling fat loss sort of came about, is that your body stores carbohydrates as glycogen in muscles, and that glycogen naturally pulls in water. So when you increase your carb intake, you may see a temporary increase on the scale, and that is water, not fat. And this fluctuation is normal, and having that glycogen in your muscles is actually beneficial for your performance. It's not a bad thing. And then as for bloating, 9 times out of 10, it's not the carbs themselves that cause the issues. That just wouldn't make sense because your cells actually run off carbs in the form of glucose, the simplest form of carbohydrates. So it wouldn't make sense for your body not to be able to digest and absorb them without sort of having this reaction of bloating. But the issue is usually things like a sudden significant change in your diet, and whether that's the type of food you're eating or the quantities or both, because your digestive system just isn't used to it yet. And then it can come down to specific food sensitivities. You don't need to rule out all carbs just because one food doesn't sit well with you. And there might be specific foods or ingredients that cause issues that you hadn't even considered might be a factor. Another thing that can cause digestive issues with carbs is this swinging between undereating and overeating and never giving your digestive system a consistent nutritious intake that it can get to grips with and almost be able to settle into a routine with. And then the final culprit for digestive issues and bloating when it comes to carbs can come down to the types of carbs you're having and when. And we are going to come on to that next before we dive into the exciting part, understanding exactly how much you need to eat and why. So stay tuned. So let's talk about the second mistake that athletes make, which is treating all carbs the same when we need to be paying attention to what types of carbs we're having. Whilst ultimately the carbs that we eat are broken down into glucose, how easily and quickly we do this depends on what carb sources we eat. So if you consume pure glucose, your body doesn't need to break it down, so digestion is fast, it can absorb it very quickly and use it quickly. If you consume complex carbohydrates, your body takes longer to process them. For example, starch is a big complex molecule consisting of lots of sugar molecules bound together, and during digestion, your body can gradually break that molecule down, and as it does so, you can absorb the glucose into your blood. So when you eat these more complex, big carbohydrate molecules, you don't get a big amount of energy all in one go, you get a gradual supply, like drip feeding it. And what most athletes do, or at least try to do, because athletes are human and get cravings too, so it doesn't always go to plan, is stick to, quote, clean foods, aka these complex carbohydrates, foods that are generally labeled as healthy. I'm talking things like oats, brown rice, whole grain pasta, fruits, etc. And these are all amazing foods and you absolutely should be including them, but they're not going to work for pre-workout fuel if you're eating within 60 to 90 minutes of training. And if you're doing particularly long sessions, then you definitely don't want to be topping up your energy in the middle of an intense cardio workout with a hearty bowl of porridge. And I'm going to go into more detail on the types and timings of carbs later in this episode. But for now, just know that if you're training hard, these foods that are labeled as bad by wellness culture and mainstream fitness, things like non-whole grain cereals, white bread, fruit juice, and smoothies, sports drinks, sweets, or even certain sugary supplements specifically designed to support athletic performance, these are things that you will most likely benefit from as an athlete if you know how to use them to your advantage. In day-to-day sedentary life, sure, you don't want to be living off sugary foods, but around training, they are literally performance fuel. And all too often, I see athletes avoiding sugar out of fear and then sort of wondering why their legs are disappearing halfway through a workout when they started off feeling really strong. And one of the reasons these fast carbs have been demonized is because they're looked at in the context of average general population health. But you need to remember that you are not average. You're going to the gym, or maybe you're getting outside if you're a runner or a cyclist too. And you need to start viewing different types of carbs not as good or bad, but as suitable or unsuitable fuel sources for what you need and when. And I love this quote from an expert panel report titled High Quality Carbohydrates and Physical Performance in the Nutrition Today journal. And I will link the full article in the show notes, but it says many sports nutrition researchers have lamented that basic feeding principles are often forgotten in the quest to find the next big thing, because the general misunderstanding about limiting carbohydrate intake for health reasons in the physically inactive population has become more prevalent. Some have lost sight of the fact that athletes have an unequivocal need to consume high carbohydrate foods to enhance muscle glycogen storage and deliver carbohydrate to muscle during strenuous exercise. In simple terms, we can't apply general population health guidelines that are based on an inactive population to athletes because it limits performance. And I want to share a quick example of a former client of mine, and this is just one of many examples, but I remember this one very distinctly because she was quite firmly on the side of being scared of eating more carbs and saying, like, I feel really good without eating before I train in the morning. In the past, when she had tried eating before her early morning workouts, she'd felt sick. She agreed to try it again, but this time she tried just drinking a small glass of fruit juice because that was something that wasn't going to make her feel sick, make her feel full. It was something that was going to digest quickly and even hydrate her somewhat. And she messaged me after her first session saying that she literally could not believe the difference in that she was able to push harder for longer. Like previously, she'd feel like she'd start strong but drop off mid-workout. And needless to say, she never went back to low-carb training or training fasted again. And that is just one example of one session. So if you imagine the compounding effects of fueling properly day in, day out on your long-term consistency in training and therefore your long-term performance and results. So to recap that one, not all carbs are the same. And when you are an active individual, an athlete of any level, you don't need to shy away from this and avoid sugary foods. You need to embrace it and use it to your advantage. Which brings me very nicely onto the final big mistake that athletes make, which ties the first two together, and that is timing your carbs correctly. This is the one that I think gets overlooked the most, especially when you've got to a point when you are consistent with your macro targets and you're eating about the right amount of total carbs each day. And it can be a case of like not really realizing the importance, or like me, occasionally getting complacent even when you know better. And full disclosure, I am not and will never claim to be perfect. So I get this wrong sometimes too. And simply put, if you are eating the right amount of carbs in total, but you are eating them at the wrong times, your performance and recovery can still tank. And this idea of timing can apply not just within each day, but also across the course of a week. So we need to be eating a larger proportion of our carbs around our training sessions because that is when our bodies need the energy the most. And this is especially true for longer, more intense training sessions where you might even need to add carbs during the session to keep your energy availability high. And you can think about this like having the heating on. You're going to prioritize having it on when you're actually home, and eating carbs at completely the wrong time, like training first thing in the morning with minimal carbs, then binging on sweet treats in the evening, is kind of like turning the heating on and having a nice warm house when you're out and about, but then turning it off and feeling freezing when you're actually home. It doesn't make sense and it's no fun for anyone. And when it comes to distributing carbs across the week, a similar thing applies. You want your energy intake to be higher when your energy output is higher. So even if you're eating on average enough carbs across the week, if you're eating the same on a rest day as you are on a big training day, you're potentially overfueling on the rest day and underfueling on the training day. So that distribution is important too. And yet some of the most common mistakes I see athletes make without like even realizing how much of an impact it's having on them are things like, number one, training early with nothing in the tank because they think that they can't eat before or that they've tried eating before training and it didn't work. Hint, hint, as I've already alluded to, it's most likely because they were eating the wrong thing. And that relates to the second thing, which is eating high fiber, slow digesting carbs too close to training and then feeling bloated, sluggish, and low on energy. And then I also see people forgetting or just not realizing the importance of topping carbs back up after training. It's not just pre-training carbs that matter. And then when it comes to distributing carbs, things like eating the same amount of calories and carbs every day, and then wondering why they feel so tired on training days, even though they're eating enough overall, or spreading carbs evenly across the entire day because they think that's the best way to balance them, or the classic, and hands up, I am absolutely guilty of this one too, saving all your carbs for nighttime when that's actually when you need them the least, especially those fast, sugary, sweet treat carbs. So athletes are making these mistakes and then wondering why they're feeling tired, foggy, under-recovered, not making progress, all of those classic symptoms of underfueling. And what I've just mentioned with regards to carb timing is referred to carb periodization, and I'm going to break that down in more detail later in the episode. But first, let's look what carbs actually do for your body when you train, as well as a little look at what they do outside of training and what it can look like when you don't have enough. So I've touched upon carbs being your primary fuel source, but let me explain a bit more why this is the case. When we exercise, we need energy, and our body can use different fuels to get this energy, so it has a few options. One of those options is fat, body fat and dietary fat, the fat that you eat. But the problem with relying on fat is that it's a very slow process to convert the fat into energy, so it can keep you going like day to day, sitting down and doing really low intensity activity, but it can't power high intensity activity where you need lots of energy quickly. When you need that energy, your best fuel source is carbohydrates. And by the way, it's not completely one or the other. Your body can switch between them and use a bit more of the carbohydrate energy pathway or the fat energy pathway, depending on what you're doing and what fuel is available. But if you want to feel and perform your best, you want to make sure you've got plenty of the best fuel, which is carbohydrates. And this is where glycogen comes back in. I mentioned it earlier in the episode, but I want to talk a little bit more about it now because it's important for understanding how our bodies store and then are able to use carbs. So I mentioned that glycogen is your body's carbohydrate storage unit, and it can be stored in the muscles and the liver, but we're going to keep things simple and relevant today by focusing more on the glycogen that's stored in your muscles, although the liver is still super important. So your muscles are your fuel tank and glycogen is the fuel, and your body then breaks down that glycogen into glucose, aka sugar, to burn for energy. And if you've got a big journey ahead, aka a long and/or intense training session, then you're going to need a full fuel tank, aka you're going to need to make sure your glycogen stores are topped up, which you do by consuming enough carbohydrates and of course consuming them at the right times. And then if you've got an extra long session where you're using even more petrol, so to speak, then you might even need to stop along the journey for a top up, which is where intra-workout carbs come in, and that is consuming carbs during your workout. So you've got this fuel tank. What happens when your fuel tank runs out or you try and run on an empty fuel tank? Well, luckily to keep you alive, your body is more like a hybrid vehicle. So if you haven't got any carbs available, it will switch over to fats, kind of like switching over to relying on an electric motor. It can't accelerate as hard or go as fast or as far, but it can keep you moving. And so in real terms, here's how that scenario can play out in training. It can look like feeling like you've hit a wall mid-workout. It can look like not being able to lift as heavy or produce as much power. You will slow down, whether it's running, cycling, rowing, swimming, a WOD. You just won't be able to keep up the pace. In more extreme cases, you can even start to feel dizzy and shaky and even get exercise-induced hypoglycemia, which is where your blood sugar drops too low. And this can also cause symptoms like an excessively high heart rate and sweating, like above what you would expect for the activity that you've been doing. And I remember the first time this happened to me, I was actually working with a nutritionist who I now realize was way more interested in seeing me get leaner and drop scale weight every week rather than actually making sure my health and my performance was optimized. But I actually finished a training session in my home gym. I came inside, I went upstairs, was running a bath, and I started to feel like really dizzy, really shaky, started sweating. And so I just lay down at the top of the stairs and I literally shouted out to my mum, who, absolute angel, brought me a bowl of chopped up fruit, which I think that is the purest form of love if someone would chop up a bowl of fruit for you. But yeah, she brought me this fruit and I ate it and I felt absolutely fine, literally a couple of minutes later. But it was literally just a case of I hadn't started my session with enough fuel in the tank or kept my carbs topped up enough during the session to support the level of activity that I was doing. And so my body just couldn't keep up and my blood sugar dropped. And actually, if you then don't top up quickly with carbs, that can be pretty dangerous. So yeah, just a fun little personal story from my days and my experiences under fueling that I don't want to happen to you. Another surprising thing that lack of carbs can affect is your coordination. So your skill development and execution can drop off, which could be things like throwing accuracy in team sports or precision in executing an Olympic lift or your ability to refine and execute your gymnastic skills. So lots of things that can start to just subtly break down, because what's interesting is that it's not just your muscles that need carbs. Your brain literally runs on glucose. So just to stay alive, your body has this cool mechanism called gluconeogenesis, whereby even if you don't eat carbs, it can create glucose out of other molecules like proteins and fats, just so that your brain has glucose to keep you alive. So yeah, that is more evidence that we are not designed to follow low carb diets. And also it's an interesting thing to think about when we're looking at carbs, not just for performance, but for day-to-day life, because outside of training, low carbs could be impacting your mood, your concentration, irritability. And like, I know personally that my ADHD symptoms are much worse if I'm not eating enough carbs, because my brain needs that fuel. So we've covered carbs for training and we've covered carbs for your brain, but there's one more thing that I think gets really overlooked because protein gets all the credit here, and that is carbs for recovery. I talked about protein being one of the raw materials needed for recovery between training sessions last week, but I also talked about your body needing the time and energy between sessions to be able to lay those building blocks. And carbs are an essential factor in your body actually having the energy to be able to use the raw materials that you give it, like protein, for recovery. Because recovery isn't just like this passive process in your body. Your tissues need energy to be able to rebuild and repair, just like you would need energy if you were to go out and do a day of bricklaying, so to speak. So under-eating carbs after training will delay recovery, plus not eating enough overall in the window between one session and the next means that your fuel tank, those glycogen stores, aren't being topped up, so you're going to be underfueled for your next session. And this combination of post-workout carbs and adequate total carb intake in between sessions is going to absolutely transform your session-to-session consistency. It's one of the most overlooked reasons that people feel strong and fit some days, but get absolutely crushed by a workout other days. So you get your fueling more consistent, and then your training becomes more consistent. And when your training gets more consistent, then your results and your progress get more consistent too. So hopefully I have sold you on the fact that carbs matter. Now it is time to talk about the question that everyone actually wants the answer to. Okay, Georgia, but how many carbs should I be eating? And the answer is it depends, but not in a vague, unhelpful way. It depends on your training load, your goals, your nutrition phase, e.g. whether you're in a deficit, surplus, or at maintenance, as well as your preferences. So I'm going to kick things off with explaining sort of the standard guidelines, the type of guidelines that you would get in sports nutrition textbooks. And then, as I like to do, share my personal, actually practical and flexible for real life recommendations. So traditional carbohydrate intake guidelines are based on a range of grams per kilo of body weight per day. And this number of grams will be higher or lower depending on the volume and intensity of your training. So for lighter training sessions, the recommendation is 3 to 5 grams of carbohydrates per kilo of body weight per day. And this covers things like shorter training sessions, lower volume and technique work. For moderate training, we're looking at 5 to 7 grams per kilo, typically somewhere in the range of 60 to 90 minutes in a fairly intense session. And then for hard training days, you're looking at 6 to 10 grams per kilo. And we're thinking long 2-hour plus sessions, high intensity, and things like double training sessions. And then for some athletes, especially hardcore endurance athletes, they might need even more than this, looking at 8 to 12 grams per kilo of body weight per day. And this would be in cases where you're training hours on end, doing long runs and cycles, for example. So on the surface, these ranges seem quite simple and convenient, right? You just take your body weight and you take the grams and you multiply them. But we actually run into several problems when we try to apply them practically. First of all, how do I know how to classify my training? Does it fall within the light, moderate, hard, or sort of ultra endurance range? There's a lot of scope for interpretation or misinterpretation here. Next, even if I have some good guidance and I decide that my training fits within the hard classification, then I've got a range of 6 to 10 grams per kilo of body weight to work with, which is anywhere between 474 to 790 grams for me. So the top end of that range is almost double the bottom end. So how the hell am I supposed to know what I should actually be aiming for? And then on top of that, what do you do if you've got calorie and protein targets that you know are correct for your body and your goals based on the testing phase and the protein intake guidelines I covered in the last 2 episodes, and you try and use these range, but using them means that you end up outside of your calorie targets because your carbs are either too high or too low? So to me, these ranges just don't capture all of the considerations that you need to make and that I make when setting people's macro targets to be able to set an appropriate carb target that matches your energy needs as well as your goals. So here is how I set targets, and this is the framework that I use inside A and B when I take all of the guesswork out and set your targets for you. And that is, first, we establish your calorie needs. And if you haven't already listened to episode 4, you're going to want to listen to that next, because having the right calorie target is going to be essential for setting your carb targets. Once we've got your calorie target, next comes protein. And again, I covered this last week, but starting with a ballpark figure of around 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, sometimes a little lower depending on your body composition and preferences, but whatever that protein intake is, that is going to stay fixed, even if you increase or decrease your calorie intake later down the line. Then we are going to set your fat intake. And this one's a bit more variable, again, depending on your current diet, your preferences, and what nutrition phase you're in. But we're always keeping it above a healthy minimum, which is a bit higher for women because we need a little bit more to support hormonal health. So you've got calories, you've got protein, and you've got fats. Calculating your carbs from here is just a very simple equation. You're going to subtract the calories you're getting from protein and fats from your total intake, and then the rest is going to be allocated to carbs. So if I've got a target of 2,500 calories per day, 140 grams of protein and 70 grams of fat, I'm subtracting my calories from protein, which is 140 times 4, 560 calories, because protein has 4 calories per gram, and I'm also subtracting my calories from fats, which is going to be 70 times 9, 630 calories, because fats have 9 calories per gram. So once I've subtracted them from my total calorie targets, that leaves me with 1,310 calories remaining to get from carbs. Carbs, like protein, have 4 calories per gram. So divide that by 4, I get 327.5. So I'm going to round that up to 330 grams for simplicity. So I've basically taken my calorie target and filled in the gaps with carbs, depending on my protein and my fat intake. So from this method, you can see that carbs are dynamic. They're the macro that are typically going to require the most adjustment depending on your goals. Like if you want to be in a calorie deficit, you'll need to consume less energy, and you'll typically therefore be taking that energy from carbs. On the flip side, if you are in a calorie surplus, piling on more protein to your targets when you're already consuming enough protein to maximize muscle growth isn't what you want. Instead, you will typically increase carbs and sometimes fats too to provide you with more energy to train hard and recover well. And so far, I've talked about your carb intake and your calorie intake in respect to your average daily intake. And sure, just eating enough carbs on average is going to be a massive improvement for most people. But we can take things from good to absolutely game-changing for your performance, your energy, and your recovery, and really maximize your day-to-day fueling by applying this dynamic approach to carbs to your daily intake. So instead of eating a fixed number of carbs and calories day in, day out, you can start basing your daily intake on your daily energy expenditure. And this is something that we call carb cycling, or sometimes it's called calorie cycling, since eating more carbs on some days and less on other days is also going to result in eating higher or lower calories on certain days too. And this might sound complicated, and honestly, it can be if you want it to be, but we can also keep it really, really simple and then build it up gradually if you want to add more complexity. And so here is how you can start implementing some carb cycling into your nutrition plan. Your first step is to start off with a simple 2-day carb cycle, meaning you have certain training day targets and certain rest day targets. And this is going to be as simple as on training days, you're going to shift your carbs up slightly, and then on rest days, you are going to shift them down slightly. So if you want to give this simple carb cycling a go, I recommend starting off by adding 10 to 20 grams of carbs on your training days. And then once you've made that increase on your training days, you're also going to need to nudge your rest day carbs down slightly to balance out your total weekly carb intake or your average weekly carb intake. So actually the difference between your rest days and your training days is going to be greater than 10 to 20 grams once you've made the adjustments. So if I increase my carbs by 10 grams on my 5 training days a week, that is 50 grams of total carbs that I've increased by. And then if I have 2 rest days, I will need to reduce carbs by 25 grams on each of them to balance it out. And once I've done that, there's actually a total difference of 35 grams of carbs between my training days and my rest days. And I could, of course, increase this difference too, But just be aware that the more you increase your carbs on those training days, the more you're also going to need to decrease them on rest days. So if you make that increase too big, then you could end up with rest days that are just too low carb, impossible to stick to. So it's really important to find that balance. And also, just in case anyone might be confused by this, if you make sure that your average weekly carb intake is the same once you've made these adjustments, then your average weekly calorie intake will also be the same. So you don't need to adjust that separately. So that is your simple 2-day carb cycle. The next option you have is to add a third training day target for harder or longer training sessions or double training days. So you will just add even more carbs to this day. And then of course you will need to adjust other days down to account for this. And exactly where you choose to make these downwards adjustments will depend on things like your appetite and your energy levels. Like, don't slash your carbs on rest days if you're already feeling super hungry with the slightly lower calorie targets, for example. So you always want to be balancing the theory of fueling well with what's actually practical and realistic to stick to, because a perfect plan that you don't execute is just not going to change anything for you. And then we can level it up even more with advanced carb cycling and completely personalize and customize your carb intake to your training schedule, which is especially helpful if your sessions are quite different each day. And this is where my calorie cycling calculator comes in. And this is actually included in phase 4 of the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint, which is called Meal Timing Mastery. But I have also set up Meal Timing Mastery as a standalone program that you can join on its own if you don't want everything from the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint, but you do want access to the meal timing guidance, the calculators, and all of the walkthroughs. And you can find all of the information about the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint and Meal Timing Mastery in the show notes. But essentially what this advanced carb cycling involves is determining a percentage increase in carbs based on your training. And we account for your training intensity and how long your training session is to do that. So for example, you will increase by around 5% for a low intensity session under 60 minutes, but by around 20% for a high intensity session that is 90 minutes. And by the way, determining whether to class your session as low, moderate, or high intensity is also covered inside the curriculum, so there is no confusion there. And so you'll pick your numbers, your percentage increases based on your training, and your exact calorie, carb, macro targets are all calculated automatically for you. Honestly, it's kind of genius if I do say so myself, and I use it to set my own calorie and carb targets on my different training days. And as I said, you can get that either by joining A and B, which is available still at the introductory price of just £297, but only until midnight 1st of December 2025, when the price goes up to £497, and the price will not be this low again. Or you can get access to all of this inside Meal Timing Mastery, and that is currently on sale for just £99. Again, that ends tomorrow at midnight, and then the price goes back up to £199. All of the information about both of those programs I have put below in the show notes. I really hope you take advantage of these amazing offers, and I can't wait for you to start using the calculators for yourself. But if you choose not to, remember I have still given you those guidelines for starting to put some carb cycling in place, starting with a 2-day carb cycling regime, so having training day and rest day carb targets, and potentially adding a third option if you have some bigger, tougher training days with a higher energy expenditure. And one final layer to add to carb cycling: if you are someone whose training load swings wildly across the week, maybe some days you have really long runs, long rides, brick sessions, race prep, which has been the case for several of my clients who've been training for things like Ironmans, then you might consider applying a carbs per hour of training protocol to top up from your baseline carb needs. So if you start a training block and your total training time is around 7 hours per week, and then you start increasing the length of maybe your Saturday run or ride, for example, then you could look at adding around 30 to 60 grams of extra carbs per extra hour of training, so that you are scaling your energy intake up as your energy expenditure ramps up. And that is quite a specific scenario, but it's an important one. And if you've got questions, please pop them in the comments or get in touch. But now we have covered carb cycling, which is matching your daily intake to your daily needs. There is one more layer that we need to add, and that is what carbs you choose to eat and when you eat them. Eating the right amount of carbs is a great start, but the next thing that people get wrong, and this is a big one for people who are technically eating enough carbs, and as I said, even I'm guilty of this at times if I let my habits slip, and that is carb distribution across the day. Because most people eat carbs on a convenience basis rather than in a using them for fuel strategic way. And to use that analogy again, eating your carbs at the wrong time is a bit like turning your heating on full blast when you're out of the house and then switching it off the second you walk through the door. Technically, you used the energy, but it did nothing for you when you actually needed it. So as a result, you felt cold when you were at home, e.g., you felt shit in training, and then you wasted all that money on heating, e.g., you ate all those carbs, but then you sat down and you didn't actually use them for energy during training. So obviously your body's energy needs fluctuate day to day, but really this is because they actually fluctuate hour to hour and even minute to minute, right? In the hour or so I spend recording, my body doesn't need as much energy as it did in the hour or so I spent training earlier, and it will need even less energy when I'm lying horizontal in front of the TV this evening, right? So I want to be giving my body more energy when it needs it and when it can best utilize it. And that doesn't mean no carbs around training, it just means consuming a higher proportion of your carbs around training, while still eating enough carbs at other meals to support your energy, your focus, your appetite, and mood, plus general recovery between sessions, because recovery is a constant process, not just something that happens in the hour or two after training. But we do want to be prioritizing carbs around the biggest spike in our energy demands, which typically will be before, during, and after training. And this brings us to the natural next question, which loops back to what I talked about earlier in this episode about the biggest mistakes athletes make with carbs. Okay, Georgia, so what types of carbs should I be eating and when? Because carb timing only works when you also choose the right type of carbs for the moment. And as we've covered, some carb sources digest slowly, are high in fiber, and provide a steady drip feed of energy and don't cause big upticks in your blood sugar. Whereas other carbs digest and are absorbed into the bloodstream quickly, and your body can use them for energy extremely quickly. And these are slow versus fast carbs. Now, in reality, these carbs exist on a spectrum. Like, we can't divide every carb heavy food into complex or slow versus simple or fast carbs. A lot of foods sit somewhere in the middle, but the great thing about this spectrum is that it actually aligns very nicely with the timeline along which you should eat these types of carbs in proximity to training. And so I'm now going to take you through the different types of carbs and when you should eat them in relation to your workouts to feel and perform your best. Let's start by talking about slow carbs. Now, examples include oats, whole grain breads, whole grain pasta, brown rice, lentils, beans, potatoes, most fruits, and also high fiber whole grain cereals. And also vegetables in general would be on this end of the spectrum, although they're not exactly a high carb source unless you eat loads of them, but that is where they would land in terms of being complex or slow carbs. So these foods, as I've already mentioned, digest slowly, they keep you fuller for longer and reduce blood sugar spikes and crashes, making them perfect for any meals and snacks that you aren't consuming within the 90 minutes to 2 hours before training sessions. They're also ideal for rest days and also to include post-workout, which I will talk about more shortly. What they are not good for is pre-workout fuel close to training or topping up energy during your workout because your body can't digest them quickly, meaning you'll not get the energy from them in time to use it, but on top of that, it can cause digestive issues because your body diverts blood flow away from your digestive system to your muscles when you're training, so you can end up feeling heavy and bloated too. So to reiterate, anything that is high fiber, whole grain, typically plant-based, and minimally processed will fall into this category. Amazing for health and fullness, but absolutely crap for pre-workout fuel. Now, the next thing I want to come on to is medium carbs. Now, most people will lump everything that isn't one of those complex carbs that I've just mentioned. They'll lump them all together and class them as fast carbs or simple carbs. But I want to spare a moment for the middle ground. Things like white rice, white pasta and bread, more processed cereals, and some fruits like ripe bananas or tin fruits, which are lower in fiber because they don't have the skin. And these digest a lot faster than your slow complex carbs, but they still do take a reasonable time to digest. Like, you're not exactly going to want to eat a bowl of rice 5 minutes before you start a run, right? So exactly when you eat these will depend on the exact carb source, whether it's closer to the fast or slow end of that carbohydrate digestion speed spectrum. And it will also depend on how much you're eating of it and also your personal digestion, because that does vary between people too. And figuring out exactly what works for you can take a bit of trial and error. But typically we're talking about these medium digesting carbs being a great option to eat in the window that is around 60 to 90 minutes before your training, potentially slightly closer for those faster digesting foods in smaller quantities if that works for you. And personally, these are my favorite category of pre-workout carbs. I find that if I have slow carbs further from training, I can find myself physically hungry during training. Even if I've technically eaten enough carbs, it just doesn't feel good. But if I eat fast carbs closer to training, I get that same problem in that they don't fill me up because they're not as filling. So I personally get most of my pre-workout carbs from these sort of medium range carbs that are substantial enough to be filling and also digest in the right time frame for me to be able to go into my session with enough energy and be able to carry that energy all the way through. And then the final category we are going to talk about are your fast carbs. And these are your performance carbs, or you might want to think of them as your workout carbs. And that can include things like jam, honey, fruit juice, Rice Krispie bars, smoothies, sweets, sports drinks, things like carb gels and other sports supplements like you've got glucose chews and glucose tablets. And these are literally supplements that are designed to give athletes a quick source of energy. And often they might be in liquid form because this can further speed digestion and absorption and have the added benefit of helping you to stay hydrated, which is obviously also important for performance. So they get into your bloodstream fast. Again, not great for if you're sitting at your desk and don't need a blood sugar spike, but they're actually perfect for athletes who need an immediate supply of fuel. And far from being bad or toxic, they are actually the best option in certain scenarios, specifically in the 30 minutes before your training session. And some people like to combine a full meal with slow carbs a few hours from training with a fast carb top up just before. They find that strikes a nice balance between keeping you full and managing any digestive issues. And these fast carbs are also perfect to consume during long or intense sessions or between sessions or workouts with relatively short breaks between them. They can also be great to have immediately post-workout, especially with some protein. And I say this specifically because exercise increases glucose uptake. So your muscles are actually better able to take in and utilize the sugar you're getting from your fuel after exercise. So your body will be able to kickstart that recovery. And those post-workout fast carbs can go really nicely with a full balanced meal, whether that's alongside them or a bit later. And that is another nice example of combining the different types of carbs so that you're getting the best of both worlds, in the words of Hannah Montana. So to summarize the different types of carbs and when to eat them, you're going to eat slow carbs when you need a steady drip feed of energy away from training, on rest days, meals at work, things like that. You're going to eat medium carbs within the 60 to 90 minutes pre-training window, or in smaller amounts up to 30 minutes before training. And you can also combine them with faster carbs closer to training or slower carbs further from training too. They can also be great to include in your post-workout meal. And then you are going to eat the fastest digesting carbs immediately before, during, or after training. And by the way, if you want me to go into even more detail on specific workout fueling, please let me know in the comments what questions you have, what you struggle with, so that I can answer all of that in a future episode. Okay, this has been a big one, and I want to make sure you are coming away from this episode with strategies that you can actually use in your day-to-day training and life. So I'm now going to recap the main points I've made, and there are timestamps below too, so you can easily reference back to any parts of the episode that you need to listen to again to really let those bits sink in. So the first key point that we covered are that carbs are not the enemy. They are actually your best friend when it comes to fueling your training. They give you energy to push hard in your sessions, as well as for your body to be able to carry out recovery processes between sessions, and even your brain needs them. Next, eating enough carbs is just the first step. Eating them at the wrong times can still tank your performance and recovery. For your carb intake to be most effective, you need to be bringing on that fuel for when you need it most. Which brings us on to the next thing we covered, carb cycling. At its simplest, this means eating a bit more on training days and a bit less on rest days. And if you're really looking to optimize, especially if your training is very different every day of the week, then you can refine it further, adding an extra high training day option with even more carbs, or adding carbs per hour of additional activity. And of course, meal timing mastery, which is linked below and is included within the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint, will set these carb targets for you. Next, we talked about carb distribution, specifically timing your carbs so you're eating a higher proportion of them around your training sessions when your energy expenditure is highest, which brings us on to the final point, which is that the types of carbs that you eat matters. Closer to training, you'll go for faster to digest, more sugary carbs, and further from training and on rest days, you'll prioritize slower carbs to promote a steady supply of energy and to help regulate your appetite too. And if you take just one thing from this episode, let it be this: that strategic carbs are the most underutilized key to better, more consistent training and results. And if this episode has got you rethinking how you fuel or has got you excited at the idea of putting it all into practice, but you want support and clear step-by-step guidance, turning all of this into a plan that is completely personalized to your body, your training, and your goals, then I've got something really exciting for you. The Athlete Nutrition Blueprint is available right now at its introductory price of just £297, but only until Monday the 1st of December at midnight. After that, the introductory price ends and it goes up to £497, and the price will never be this low again. Inside the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint, or ANB as we call it for short, I take all of the guesswork out of your fueling. I set your personalized calorie and macro targets, including your carb targets. You learn how to eat to fuel, recover, and perform your best without the restriction or confusion, including an entire module on the practical side of actually hitting your targets and being consistent with them. You'll also learn how to adapt your personalized targets to keep up with your goals. Whether you want to lose fat, build muscle, body recomp, reverse diet, it is all covered. And quite possibly my favorite part, you get access to the full meal timing mastery module, which includes the carb cycling calculator that I've mentioned, plus meal timing calculators that show you exactly how to spread your macros across the day based on your training, including knowing exactly how much carbohydrate to eat and when. And these are all calculators that I personally use. I use them in the lead up to competing at my first World Weightlifting Championships, and I'm using them now in my preparation for the English Championships next weekend. And if you want just the meal timing mastery part, I have put a link below to get access to just that module too, and you can get it for half price again until midnight on Monday the 1st of December. I should also mention that you get lifetime access to all of this, so this is not a quick fix. It's not a 12-week program that you need to complete right now and then you're done. So when you join today, you can lock in that introductory price and you'll get instant access, but then it's up to you whether you actually dive in right now or wait until January when life maybe feels a bit calmer. And there is even an interest-free pay-in-3 option to make things even more affordable at just £99 per month. Make sure you check the link in the show notes to join before the price goes up. And if you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, I would love if you could leave a rating or review. It helps more people find the show and means that I can help more athletes just like you learn to fuel and train to feel and perform their best. And of course, if you've got questions about carb timing, carb cycling, or pretty much anything else, please drop a question in the comments. I would love to help. And finally, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of The Unfiltered Athlete. I can't wait to see you again next week.